church. And the story of the Cathars is absolutely amazing. I'm looking really forward to sharing this video series with you. I will be reading directly from this book by Graham Hancock. Hear their amazing story that maybe you will hear deep in your soul, the call to return to your own Cathar roots in spirit. Mixed with the many other currents and forces that are acknowledged to have driven the French Revolution, we tried to demonstrate in Chapter 1 that powerful religious and spiritual energies were also at play. These energies surfaced visibly in an aggressive de-Christianization campaign that saw great cathedrals, including the famous Notre Dame in Paris, reconsecrated as temples of the Supreme Being. Throughout the land, ancient Egypt and other pagan images were substituted for Christian symbols, notably the cross, and even ancient Egyptian deities such as the goddess Isis were venerated. The convention was thus not referring to the God of the Christians or to the Christian vision of the afterlife when it affirmed in 1794 that the people of France recognized the existence of the Supreme Being and the immortality of the soul. Strange and startling though these developments were, the late 18th century was not the first time that a religion utterly opposed to Christianity, showing signs of an ancient Egyptian influence and deeply interested in the fate of the soul, had taken root in the land we now know as France. In the 12th century, more than 600 years before the Revolution, just such an alternative religion had materialized in Provence and Languedoc, seemingly out of nowhere. Already deeply entrenched in the hearts and minds of large sectors of the population, it was also present in force in adjoining districts of eastern Spain and northern Italy, and scattered in smaller communities throughout the rest of Europe, as far afield as Belgium, northern France, and Germany. The name of this region that had so rapidly and successfully displaced the Roman Catholic Church in areas so close to the seat of its own power was Christianity. At any rate, its practitioners called themselves good Christians, but the church labeled them heretics from the moment they first came to its attention. Their contemporaries are the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries frequently called them Manichees, after the ancient dualistic heresy of Manichaeism, supposedly wiped out in Europe hundreds of years previously. And they were also known by a wide variety of other epithets, including most commonly Albigensians, after Albi, a prominent city of Languedoc, and Cathars, derived from the Greek word katharos, and meaning the pure. These Cathars, the name we will generally use here, venerated Jesus Christ every bit as much as the Catholics did. That was why they called themselves good Christians. But the place that he occupied in their religion was radically different. In the Catholic view, Christ was the Word made flesh who dwelt among us. The Cathars refuted this utterly and worshipped him as a being of pure spirit, an emanation from the good God, a projection or an apparition. They categorically denied his material incarnation as the Son of God, born in a human body to dwell among us. They also forcefully rejected the Catholic teaching of Christ crucified for sins. How could he have been crucified, they asked, if he had never existed physically in the first place? Far from revering the central spiritual symbol of Christianity, therefore, the Cathars denied the significance of the cross. For them, it was an obscene instrument of torture that the Church of Rome had misled millions into worshiping as an idol. Turning the most cherished symbols, doctrines, and dogmas of Christianity upside down like this was a Cathar specialty that infuriated and repeatedly challenged the medieval Catholic Church. The source of the problem was that unlike the single, all-powerful, and all-good God of the Christians, the Cathars were dualists who believed in the parallel existence of two deities, a God of good and a God of evil. Each was powerful only in his own domain and nearly impotent in the realm of the other. The domain of the God of good was entirely spiritual, intangible, immaterial, and filled with light. It was here that human souls had originated, the creation of the good God. The domain of the God of evil was the earth itself, the material world and all physical life upon it, an infernal place of pain and punishment filled with darkness and iniquity. In the Cathar scheme of things, it was the God of evil, the maker and ruler of the material world, who had fashioned the bodies, though not the souls, of mankind out of what they called mud and water. And it was towards the same evil God, Cathar preachers argued, that the worship of the Roman Catholic Church was directed. The Pope, in other words, was not a servant of the good God, but the devil's representative on earth. And the purpose of the Catholic Church was not to transmit our souls to the spiritual and light-filled domain of heaven after death, but to trick us into returning again and again in one human incarnation after another to the hell realm of the material world. Only a lifetime of self-denial, culminating in a special gnosis or inspired knowledge, attained on initiation into the highest grade of the Cathar faith, could save us. It was a revolutionary teaching, and in 12th century, an extremely dangerous one. Hesitating at the crossroads. During the period of world history for which written records have survived, most of the last 5,000 years, no scholar would seriously argue the proposition that religions have played a fundamental role in shaping the character of civilization and directing its course. Likewise, few would dispute that the human race during this period has consistently been divided not only by different languages and cultures, but also by the competing spheres of influence of different religions. Christianity has a near monopoly in the Americas, having obliterated or utterly marginalized all the New World's indigenous faiths during the past 500 years. It also predominates in Australia, New Zealand, Sub-Saharan Africa, and other areas of former European colonial expansion. Its historical home is in the Eastern Mediterranean. However, after the triumph of Islam in the Middle East and North Africa more than 1,000 years ago, Christianity's heartland moved to Europe itself. Today, as a result, it is a habit of mine to think of Europe as a region locked so firmly and for so long within the Christian sphere of influence that no other faith need be considered to have shaped its destiny. For scholars prepared to look hard enough, there are, of course, faint traces of earlier pagan beliefs in the European heritage, but these are rarities and throwbacks, quaint exotica with no mainstream impact. Whether we travel to Austria, Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Greece, Holland, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, Spain, or Switzerland, the reality is that all the countries of Europe confront us with very long, unbroken traditions of Christianity. In some cases, these traditions substantially predate the 4th century AD, when the Roman Empire under Constantine adopted Christianity as its state religion and established Rome, where a persecuted Christian community had already existed for 250 years, as the headquarters of the newly empowered Catholic Church. Almost immediately after coming into imperial favor, the formerly persecuted church fathers themselves turned persecutors. They sought to impose their control on Christians throughout the Roman Empire, to suppress schisms, and to distill a universally agreed doctrine out of the great variety of teachings that the faith had previously encompassed, then systematically hunted down and obliterated over the next 3 centuries. Notable among the forbidden faiths was the great dualist heresy of Manichaeism, to which no less a figure than St. Augustine, one of the foremost revered doctors of the church, had belonged for 9 years before converting to Christianity in AD 386. Claiming to lead to direct and personal knowledge of the divine, all forms of Gnosticism were also persecuted to vanishing point. Influenced by elements of the ancient Egyptian religion, Asian and Middle Eastern mysticism, Greek philosophy, and alternative interpretations of Jewish and Christian teachings, Gnosticism was as profoundly dualistic as Manichaeism, and was for some centuries the chief rival to Roman Catholic hegemony. By the 7th century, however, Manichaeism had been expelled to the distant east, and the numerous Gnostic sects that had confronted the early church seemed to have been obliterated. No longer facing any organized spiritual competition, Catholicism was able to see out the remainder of the Western Dark Ages with its defenses relaxed. The result, by the early 11th century, was that churchmen had no living experience of heresy. Those who sought to remind themselves of its dangers could only turn to books, amongst them St. Augustine's agonized account of his own, quote, errors as a Manichae, written 700 years earlier. It therefore came as something of a jolt when a heresy looking very much like Manichaeism suddenly resurfaced in the 12th century in the form of Catharism in areas at the very heart of Western culture. Moreover, it proved to be no transitory movement linked to the lives of a few charismatic leaders, but the most deadly threat ever to confront the Catholic faith. Appearing as though from nowhere, it was a well-organized anti-church that claimed an antiquity even greater than that of Catholicism itself. It also had the temerity to recruit its new members directly from Catholic ranks. What made Catharism such a threat and outrage to the Catholic Church, however, was not just its embarrassing success at converting Catholics, nor the challenge of its doctrines, radical though they were. Nor was it simply the shock of confronting a dualist heresy that seemed to have conjured itself up out of the past like a ghost, nor was it the heresy's obvious dynamism, nor the uncomfortably rapid spread of its sphere of influence ever closer to Rome during the 12th century. The real problem was that, as well as winning over large numbers of ordinary people, Catharism had succeeded in attracting the tacit and sometimes even the overt support of some of the most powerful noble families in southwestern Europe. These included, most notably, the Counts of Toulouse, the Counts of Foix, the Trencaval Viscounts, who ruled the walled cities of Albi, Béziers, and Carcassonne, with their knights and castles and strength of arms concentrated in the Languedoc and surrounding areas. Such men had transformed Catharism into something that the Church of Rome had never faced before. Here was a heresy that could fight back, that would not easily be crushed by the use of secular force, and that might conceivably, if allowed to grow further, push the Catholic religion out of Europe altogether. For more than a century, with consequences that reach us today, European civilization hesitated at the crossroads of two competing spiritual systems. Support for and involvement with the Cathars, combined with a rejection of the church, were not confined solely to the upper levels of the aristocracy. In the Lauragais, the populous area between Toulouse and Carcassonne, the minor nobility are reported to have been almost solidly Cathar. The same was also the case for their counterparts in the Corbière between Carcassonne and Narbonne. Tellingly, it has been calculated that 30% of all Cathar perfecti were of noble birth. Moreover, even the remaining Catholic nobility of Occitania were often proved to be at least sympathetic to the Cathars, and at times were openly supportive of them. An indication of their dilemma is to be seen in the reply given by the Catholic knight Pons de Adamar of Rodel, when he was asked by Fawkes, the bishop of Toulouse, why he and his co-religionists had not expelled the heretics from their lands. In reply, "We cannot. We have grown up among them. We have relatives among them, and we see them living good, decent lives of perfection." Weaving the threads of the great heresy. Thus sheltered by the aristocracy of the region on both sides of the religious divide, the Cathars also found strong support at all other levels of Occitanian society. Large numbers of them were skilled craftsmen and artisans. A list of Cathars present in the city of Béziers in 1209 includes 1 noble of Baronas, 4 doctors, 5 hosiers, 2 blacksmiths, 2 pelterers, 2 shoemakers, a sheep shearer, a carpenter, a weaver, a saddler, a corn dealer, a cutler, a tailor, a tavern keeper, a baker, a wool worker, a mercer, and a money changer. Martin Barber, professor of history at the University of Reading, observes that the Béziers list include no less than 10 individuals employed in the textile industry, and that a great many other primary documents from the period likewise link weavers or textores to the heresy. This is true both within and outside the borders of Occitania. In France, the general name by which Cathars were known was simply Texerons, the weavers. In 1145, the renowned French ecclesiastic Bernard of Clairvaux undertook a preaching tour to warn against a heresy of weavers. It had supposedly sprung up fully formed from the suggestions and artifices of seducing spirits, and was so successful at winning conversions that, quote, women have quitted their husbands, men have deserted their wives. Clerks and priests often abandon their flocks in their churches and are found in the throng among weavers, male and female. Likewise, in 1157, Archbishop Samson of Reims was almost certainly complaining of Cathar missionary activity when he spoke of a Manichaean plague that had recently infected the greater part of Flanders. We noted earlier that 12th century churchmen commonly referred to the Cathars as Manichaeans, after the dualistic sect of that name that had supposedly been stamped out hundreds of years previously. This new outbreak of heresy, Samson said, was being spread by itinerant weavers and cloth merchants. The explanation is simple. Employment as weavers and in other sectors of the medieval cloth trade, with its extensive international connections, was chosen as cover by Cathar perfecti. They needed cover to avoid early detection by church authorities because they were mounting what can only be described as a large-scale and well-thought-out missionary campaign. The rather gentle, patient, and systematic methods that they used to win local trust and eventually conversions to the heresy have been nicely described by the Canadian historian Stephen O'Shea, quote, on the paths and rivers of the Languedoc of 1150, there were not only traders and troubadours, but also pairs of itinerant holy men, recognizable by the thin leather thong tied around the waist of their black robes. They entered villages and towns, set up shop, often as weavers, and became known for their honest, hard work. When the time came, they would talk, first in the moonlight, beyond the walls, then out in the open, before the fireplaces of noble and burgher, in the houses of tradespeople, near the stalls of the marketplace. They asked for nothing, no alms, no obeisance, just a hearing. Within a generation, these Cathar missionaries had converted thousands. Languedoc had become host to what would be called the Great Heresy. The Perfecti and the Credentes. The missionaries were all Cathar Perfecti, and as Stephen O'Shea rightly observed, it was their custom, like modern Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses, to travel and evangelize in pairs. Their black robes would have given them something of the look of Christian monks or priests. Other than their appearance, however, there was really no similarity at all between the lifestyles of these perfecti and the lifestyles of the typical Catholic clergy of that period. As even their most bitter opponents were willing to admit, the distinguishing characteristic of the perfectus was that they lived exemplary lives of chastity, humility, great poverty, and simplicity throughout the whole period of Catharism's rise and fall. Meanwhile, the church of the 11th and 12th centuries had already become decadent and disreputable. It was widely despised because of the rampant sexual license of so many of its ministers. In some areas, it was openly hated because of its vast wealth, corruption, greed, and unnecessary ostentation. Doubling as large-scale feudal landlords, most bishops enjoyed lives of profligate, scandalous luxury. No wonder, then, that they were unpopular in their own dioceses, where they were reviled for their indifference to the privations of the poor. To understand the extreme asceticism for which the perfecti were renowned, one need only recall the teaching that lay at the core of Cathar dualism. The material world was the wholly evil creation. The perfecti were active participants in what they saw as a cosmic struggle between utterly incompatible powers, spirit and matter, good and evil. Success in the struggle required them to lead lives in strict accordance with their beliefs and teachings. Though often referred to as the priests of the Cathar religion, several researchers have noted that the perfecti were in reality much closer in terms of their austerities, their personal comportment, and their function within the faith to the ascetic teachers of the East, the bonzes and fakirs of China and India, the adepts of the Orphic mysteries, or the teachers of Gnosticism. The impression is enhanced by contemporary reports which seem to describe perfecti in trance-like or meditative states. One eyewitness speaks of the extraordinary sight of a Cathar perfectus seated on a chair, motionless as a tree trunk, insensible to his surroundings. But the Cathar authorities knew very well that a life of meditation, total chastity, austerity, and withdrawal from the material world was not beyond the reach of the average mortal. Moreover, their society did not and could not consist solely of perfecti and candidate perfecti whose celibacy would provide them with no successors. What was needed was a much wider pool to draw on. This was supplied by a second grade or rank far more numerous than the perfecti, known as the credentes or believers. It was they, in their tens of thousands, who constituted the vast majority of all Cathars. It was they who contributed the social and economic energy, to say nothing of the military muscle, that made this religion such a threat to the Church of Rome. What the credentes believed in were the fundamental tenets of the dualistic faith concerning the existence of two gods, the evil nature of matter, and the imprisonment of the soul in flesh. They might even aspire ultimately to becoming wandering gurus or perfectus rank themselves, but the reality was that most credentes never took up the challenge. Instead, wherever Catharism was established, we know that its credente class lived ordinary lives of no great self-denial. They married, produced children, owned property, ate well, and generally enjoyed the world.
Part of the universal human condition. What happens to us when we die? Consciousness. And really, if we're not our consciousness, then we're not anything. I mean, I don't think I'm my knees or my feet, or my gut. I'm my consciousness. That's who I am. I believe that's who we all are, our consciousness. And science doesn't know a whole lot about consciousness. This is the paradigm of mainstream science, that consciousness is generated by the brain, just the way a factory produces cars. And obviously, when the factory ceases to work, when it's broken or destroyed, as far as mainstream science is concerned, there is no more consciousness. It's over for you. So when you're brain dead, that's the end of your story as far as mainstream science is concerned, because it makes the assumption that our brains manufacture or generate consciousness. Actually, there's no proof of that. That's an unevidenced assumption. And another possibility, which I believe deserves serious consideration, is that the relationship of consciousness to the brain is more like the relationship of a TV signal to a TV set. So whereas if you destroy the factory, it indeed stops making cars, if you destroy your TV set, the signal is still there. And this may begin to answer a number of imponderable questions about the nature of consciousness, and it touches close to the paradigm of all spiritual traditions, that we are immortal spiritual beings incarnated in physical bodies temporarily. We're wearing this body like a suit of clothes, or we're manifesting through it the way a TV signal manifests through a TV set. But we are more than the sum of our parts. I mean, any gambler, they've got to say, this is 50-50. We don't know which way it's going to go. But then when you actually consider the mass of anecdotal evidence, for example, near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, the very important work that was done on reincarnation by Ian Stevens of the University of Virginia, I think it tips the balance very slightly, like 51% in favor of we do survive death, and 49% in favor of we don't, from a logical point of view. Because there's just a whole range of human experiences that are not explained by the materialistic paradigm. We need to deal with the giants of spirituality. And those, for sure, were the ancient Egyptians. a society that devoted its best minds for 3,000 years to considering nothing other than the mystery of death and how we need to live our lives to be fulfilled in death and move on. So here we see the goddess Isis feeding immortal life, that's the Ankh, symbolizing immortal life, to Pharaoh Seti I. And there was a system of religious ideas in ancient Egypt. We call it the Osirian system. Went back to the god Osiris, a divine king of Egypt who ruled in the first time when gods walked the earth. And it was he who set the model and taught the system for attaining immortality of the soul. It's worth knowing, because it's not talked about much, that the ancient Egyptians used visionary plants. The work of William Emberden is particularly important in this area, and he's concentrated on the blue water lily, Nymphaea cerulea, which turns out to be what we would call a hallucinogen today, a visionary plant. They also used mandrake, and they used the opium poppy to induce visions. I believe that it's impossible to understand the deep nature of the exploration of the afterlife realm that the Egyptians went into without taking altered states of consciousness into account. This was shamanistic work that the ancient Egyptians were doing, exploring the realms beyond this realm, and that work is always conducted in altered states of consciousness. So it's very interesting to discover that the ancient Egyptians, as you can see, idealized the blue water lily, which turns out to be a hallucinogenic plant. A couple of other systems descended from ancient Egypt. One of them was the Hermetic texts. And the Hermetic texts tell us that souls have at stake in this life their hope of eternity in the life to come. And it's our duty not to acquiesce in our physical form. We have that. It's important. It's part of who we are, but we mustn't settle for that. We have to focus and concentrate on the spiritual part of ourselves and nourish that and grow it during our lives. Because if we do not grow the spiritual part of ourselves during our lives, the hope of eternity is reduced. And that, again, is one of the problems, I believe, with the society that we live in today, because it seems to be designed to, rather than to grow, to shrink the spiritual aspect of life. It's difficult to say some of this because people who are very committed to mainstream Christianity as it is presented to us are bound to find it offensive. And indeed, mainstream Christianity found Gnosticism so offensive down the years that they burnt thousands of Gnostics at the stake. But in the Gnostic scheme of things, there's the pleroma, which emanates various divine beings. You could think of them as angels, the aeons. The lowest of these aeons is Sophia, wisdom. She undergoes some kind of cosmic cataclysm, which leads her to fall away from her true state, and she creates the demiurge. Now, the demiurge is the figure that the Gnostics identify with the figure that Christians and Jews and Muslims call Jehovah, Yahweh, the figure that we are taught to worship as God. From the Gnostic point of view, he was a demon, not a god at all. He was a demon who had disguised himself as a god. He was pompous and overblown. That's why he's constantly demanding to be adored. That's why he does murderous things, particularly in the Old Testament. He's not a god. He's somebody who pretends to be a god. And the demiurge created the material world and created human beings as his adoring public. But at the last moment, Sophia made sure that there was a spark of the divine within humanity. And the Gnostic mission is to free that spark of the divine with us from the trappings of the demiurgic material world and allow us to return to the pleroma, to the realm of spirit. So you have to understand, with Gnosticism, we have a system that does use many of the ideas of Christianity. Christ is an important figure in Gnosticism, but it puts a totally different take on Christ from mainstream Christianity as advocated by the Roman Catholic Church down the ages and other churches. For the Gnostics, there's just no way that Christ could be a physical being. Physical world was evil to the Gnostics. Something good could not take physical form. Something good could not be produced from a womb. It would not be something spiritual would not be born into a physical body in the Gnostic sense. So they regarded They regarded Christ as an apparition, or as a vision, really. And they were disgusted, for example, by the ideas of eating the body and blood of Christ, the host and the wine. This was considered, from a Gnostic point of view, a revolting and deeply disturbing idea, and quite impossible to do with a non-material being. So they see Christ as a visionary teacher who comes to show us the path to Gnosis, to get us out of this hell world that we're immersed in. So the Gnostic story of the Garden of Eden, it completely reverses things. In the mainstream Christian story, the Old Testament story, the story used in Islam as well, the serpent is the bad guy. The serpent is misleading mankind and causing us to do things which God forbade us to do. But from the Gnostic point of view, what God, this individual who calls himself God, the demiurge, has done is he's trapped mankind, and we must have knowledge of good and evil if we are to escape from his trap. So what the serpent is doing is he's bringing Gnosis to mankind, the totally opposite upending of the situation in mainstream Christianity. And so let's see how this demiurge then behaves, as we're told in the Bible. Those Adam and Eve, rather than just being dull, conditioned automata or robots who do exactly what they're told, they've eaten of the tree of knowledge. He's going to punish them horrendously for this. They're driven out of the Garden of Eden in a very humiliating way, as these images show. They're subjected to violence. Eve is told that she'll suffer pain for the rest of her days, and all women will suffer pain because of her original sin. It's really a very horrible system of ideas, I have to say, the mainstream view of the Garden of Eden. And the Gnostic view, which sees that deity as a kind of demonic force, he's punishing Adam and Eve because they've acquired some Gnosis. And he doesn't want them to have Gnosis. He wants them to stay ignorant and unaware of their spiritual potential. Again, it's very interesting that when we scratch Gnosticism deeply enough, we find the use of hallucinogenic plants. Here from France, 1291 AD, is an image of the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life. But as you'll see, the Tree of Life is not a tree. It's an Amanita muscaria hallucinogenic mushroom. And the time that this was created towards the end of the Cathar period is extremely interesting. I think there's a secret of Gnosticism being revealed here, that Gnosis, that direct contact with the divine, was undoubtedly mediated through altered states of consciousness. More punishment from the demiurge. The flood, everybody's heard of the flood of Noah. From the Gnostic point of view, that is not being done to punish mankind for being evil, as we're told in the Old Testament. It's being done to punish mankind for the growth of Gnosis, the growth of awareness. As soon as awareness starts to surface in humanity, the demiurge steps in and slaps us down. Slapped us down with the flood, and the survivors were thrown into great distraction, the Gnostic texts say, and into a life of toil, so that mankind might be occupied with worldly affairs and might not have the opportunity of being devoted to the Holy Spirit. And actually, throughout our history, those who've sought the liberating Gnosis, the light, the knowledge of the true nature of things, have been persecuted. If you go back to the origins of Christianity, you'll find that the first Christians are Gnostics. And then a very literal faction appears within Christianity, which becomes the Roman Catholic Church and which takes on the power of the jackboot power of the Roman state. And immediately they start punishing those other Christians who were Gnostics. And they punish them by burning them at the stake, depriving them of all their property, and killing them in various horrible ways. And this continues whenever a Gnostic system appears. One of them that's of great interest, which Robert Boval and I go into in our new book, The Master Game, is Catharism. Catharism was a Gnostic religion. And if you take the early Gnostics in 200 or 300 years after Christ, then the persecution following Constantine, they disappear. They go underground. And this is how they gradually surface again over the next hundreds of years. A movement of Gnosticism moving across Europe and becoming very strong here in the southwest of France in the 1200s. This was a religion that completely turned the tenets of Roman Catholicism on its head. It saw the priests of Catholicism as agents of the devil. It saw the God that the Catholics worshipped as the demon himself. It saw Christ as a non-physical rather than a physical being. And it became very powerful. And naturally, the Catholic Church responded in its time-honored way by murdering all of them. That's what happens when you take on the demiurge. Terrible things happened in Occitania, in the Languedoc, in the 1200s. When they came to Béziers, famously, what happens is the Pope grants dispensations to anybody who joins this crusading army to go and kill these Gnostics. And when they came to Béziers, they realized that there were some Catholics living in Béziers as well. And so one of the military leaders turned to the bishop and he said, what should we do about those? Should we try and save the Catholics? He said, no, kill them all. God will know which is which when it comes to heaven. You know, this was the kind of attitude that they had. Terrible things were done. Innocent, unarmed civilians killed by mounted knights. The final end of the Cathar story was the siege of Montségur in 1244, and just awful burnings at the stake going on everywhere.
But the man was quite knowledgeable about the Cathars and was able to recommend some castles he thought we should visit. Decided to travel to Montségur first because of its pivotal place in the history of the Cathars, and then our way back would take in Prévert. The Chateau de Montségur is probably the best known of all Cathar castles. Its name literally means safe hill. And for a time, the 1,200-meter high castle, poised atop a rocky mountain, was just that for the scores of dispossessed Cathar families seeking shelter from the Catholic Crusaders. In 1243, a siege began at Montségur, and 10,000 Royal Catholic troops surrounded the castle. The Pope had ordered the Cathars to convert to Catholicism or be killed. A pyre was erected at the bottom of the mountain. Inside, however, the Cathars had immense stores of food and water and were able to hold out for 10 months. When their resources became depleted in March of 1244, the Cathars announced they would surrender, but wanted a 15-day truce. This gave them time to celebrate the spring equinox one last time. On March 16, 1244, the last Cathars exited Montségur. It is said that just over 200 residents linked hands, sang, and marched down the mountain. Out of the 200,000 Cathars of France, they were all that was left after the Crusades. When they reached the bottom of the mountain, every single one walked straight into the burning fire. I thought of this incredibly moving story as Montségur came into view, of the Cathars who held out to the end and who would rather die than renounce what they believed. These amazing people would rather have been burned alive than live a lie. I found their stories so inspiring, and more than that, I felt an intense connection to the land and to these people. We stopped at the bottom of the mountain where the pyre would have been, and found a tombstone with an inscription that read, "The Cathars, martyrs of pure Christian love."
Ask yourself this. If the mainstream religion that was inflicting this kind of torture and pain on people was really a religion of goodness, would it do that? Consider what is involved in burning a fellow human being at the stake. Just consider what that person goes through. And then imagine that there's some guy standing there saying, this is being done for God. What kind of God is that? This is demonic behavior. That's certainly how the Cathars saw it. It's certainly how the Gnostics saw it, that a religion that can burn people at the stake is not a good religion. And really, from the Gnostic point of view, the demiurge and his human servants are constantly trying to steal the light, and they're certainly doing so today. And if there's a sense that the light is growing in the world today, and that there's a new emergence of consciousness, and I believe there is, watch out, because that means the demiurgic forces are going to try and slap it down again in every possible way they can to prevent the rise of consciousness. And I do see that happening today as well. Let's imagine, just for the sake of a sort of mental exercise that the Gnostic point of view is correct, and that the deity we've been taught to worship is actually a demon who's intent on minimizing human potential and stopping us ever realizing who we really are. Who would be the agents of the demiurge in the world today? Well, one of them clearly is the mainstream religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the three monotheistic faiths, all of which worship the demiurge. These religions all discourage any kind of direct spiritual experience. You're not supposed to have that. The experience is going to be mediated for you by the priest. Actually, up until 14th or 15th century, the public were not even allowed to read the Bible. Not at all. Editions of the Bible in the vernacular were not allowed. These figures, their role seems to be to suppress human consciousness, to tell us that our only connection with the supernatural may be through them. There is no other way that we may connect with it, and that if we do try to do so, they will punish us very badly. And so, yes, they burn people at the stake, they stone people to death, and they cover up pedophile priests. What do you expect from a demonic religion? And here's another agent of the demiurge, the state. A terrible force in the world today. We are being taught more and more in the West that we would not to take responsibility for ourselves. The adult responsibility is being removed, and the state is increasingly stepping into areas of intimate personal life. This cannot be good. We have to solve our own problems in this world. We can't devolve everything onto somebody else. I would say the growth of these huge, faceless bureaucracies, often armed bureaucracies, and the creation of fear, hatred, and suspicion of other states and of other peoples, which are essential to the statist way of thinking, are today. There may have been a time for the state, but the time for the state is over if we wish to progress as human beings. And right now, as human beings, the state is a huge dead hand, which is working in every way to shut down personal responsibility, devolve it all on the state, and allow us to see and know nothing. And another demiurgic force is the state of consciousness of our society. Our society really values and glorifies one particular state of consciousness, and that is the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness, for which we must admit we have a lot to be thankful for. I'm very glad about antibiotics, for example, really good thing. The alert, problem-solving state of consciousness has done some fantastic work. I don't want to throw it away, but I want us to recognize that there are other states of consciousness which are not nourished in our society and which may be very, very important to us indeed. So this alert, problem-solving state of consciousness, it's really useful for Wall Street, for politics, for doing business, for fighting wars, and for certainly the more mundane aspects of science. It's brilliant for that. But it's not brilliant at a lot of other things. For example, we live now in this world of constant panic and chaos, a feeling that everything is about to crumble around us, that all the efforts we've made over the years, just to get a bit of financial security is just going to be wiped away, that we can't rely on anything, we can't trust anything, it's always total uncertainty. The system creates a kind of psychosis of permanent anxiety that we live in. And what does that permanent anxiety do? It certainly doesn't help us to concentrate on the spiritual aspect of ourselves. It draws us again and again into the demiurgic material realm. So, our society really undermines any other form of consciousness apart from alert problem solving and occasional drunken binges. I think because of this, we really are becoming a species with amnesia, and that far from being awake and aware, all the forces in our society conspire to make us asleep and oblivious. And this is a very dangerous situation for the human soul. We're not going to move into a new state of consciousness using the old one. Our existing state of consciousness is too laden down with what the Gnostics would see as archonic constraints. We need a new form of consciousness if we're going to escape from this trap. And it's interesting that in some of the most unexpected places on Earth, where the last place that you would expect to find somebody offering you that possibility, that we actually do find that a system of direct spiritual knowledge remains very much alive.